Okay, so before we start, let's play a short game.
Okay.
So, can you please tell like two truths, one lie
Okay.
about yourself? But this truth they sounds like a lie too, so I'm gonna
Okay.
guess.
Okay. Two truth and one lie.
Yeah, give it
Okay.
out.
Okay. Um, Number one, I can speak Thai. Okay.
Okay.
Number two, I had near-death experience before.
Okay.
Okay. Number three is I am the first person to ever release a song in streaming platform.
Huh?
I was the first artist
Uh-huh.
to ever release a song in a music streaming platform.
How is it possible? Like first ever artist.
Well,
So this is a lie.
figure it out.
This
Figure
is
it
a
out.
lie.
So number three is the lie.
Yeah.
And speaking Thai and me having a near death experience is true.
Well, I believe about having near-death experience. About speaking Thai, you lived in Thai, so you're supposed to know.
Okay, so what's your verdict?
Third is a lie.
Okay. You want the truth?
Yes,
I can't speak Thai.
you can't.
I can't speak Thai.
Okay.
I had near death experience and I was the first person to ever release a song in streaming platforms.
But how does it work? Why is it first?
I was like around 16, 15, 16. And around the time, it was a time where Napster was coming up, you know, when the MP3 was a thing.
Yeah.
And there was some startup companies in Korea trying to figure out how to monetize this. How can they sell MP3s online? And around that time, there were a group of young college kids that started to build some streaming platform. At the time, it wasn't a streaming platform; it was a download platform. So it was a MP3. You could download the MP3,
Yeah.
and they would charge you for that. So they were looking for some underground artists to participate on that project, right?
So you're kind of underground.
Yeah, at 16, I think it was 16. And I was writing songs and I was uploading my songs on the internet. And these startup college students found me and asked me to participate on the project. And my song got released in their platform, and it was you needed to pay to download those songs. And I was the first artist to participate on that project. And guess what that platform has become?
Spotify?
Not Spotify. It was Melon.
Melon.
Melon is the biggest streaming platform in Korea. And
okay.
that was way before Apple Music, way before Spotify.
So you're kind of one of the builders
Yeah.
of Melon.
Yeah. So number three is truth.
What about near-death experience?
So near-death experience, when I was around like 20 years old, 21 or something, I got addicted to this game called World of Warcraft. Right?
Okay.
Like I would go on playing that game without sleep, without eating, and I went on playing that game for like 3 days without doing anything.
Wow, that's
And
crazy.
yeah, that's crazy. And I was at home playing that game, and suddenly I felt this, like my body has stiffened. I can't move, and my vision grays out. And I was just playing this game like this, and my body can't move. I can't see anything, and just like this posture, I would just fall down from my chair.
It's kind of not what you're expecting from a near-death experience, but how did you manage to figure it out?
Right. So I was like this on the floor,
Okay.
and that at that moment I remembered that I saw news, like, you know, some news you see some time to time, some game addicted players just die in front of their computers. That's what was happening to me.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And I was losing breath, and like I'm like, oh my god, this is how I die.
That's a stupid thing, how to die.
Exactly. I was so scared, and oh my, now my life is ending. And at that moment, I just imagine, okay, how would my funeral look like, right? And my
So that's what were in your head back then?
yeah, and I would imagine all my friends, my family will come to my funeral and, like cry, and someone will ask, "Hey, how did Baksa die?" He died while playing games. Like, oh no, that's not for me. I don't want that to be the end of my life. So,
Yeah.
however, I managed to like kind of crawl to my bathroom, and I turned on this hot water. Like, I didn't know what to do. So I turned on the hot water, the showers coming down, and I was just stiff. And as I was getting these hot water all over me, my body started to loosen up. And
Let's then find out how you came into IT. So this
okay,
is a diary for you and a pen for you.
I like this.
Yeah,
It feels good.
yeah.
I wonder where you found such a
I was looking for it for like a really long time.
yeah. Okay.
I was searching for a match for this podcast.
Yeah.
You can just give it to me.
All right.
So read the questions.
Oh yeah, I mean,
let's
the
discuss
first one's so easy. What name do people usually call you? Is there a story behind it? You know me. Everybody calls me Baksa, and my since I was young, my family used to call me Baksa. My friends used to call me Baksa. Maybe my parents wanted me to have some PhD or something, but anyways, while I was since childhood, my parents call me Baksa. My friends call me Baksa. I use my artist name as a Baksa, so everybody knows me as a Baksa.
Yeah, so for the people who doesn't know Korean language, Baksa means professor, PhD.
Yeah, professor, PhD. If someone calls me Taehyun, which is my actual passport name, I would know this is not my friend.
What's about the next question?
Yeah, the next one would be, how old are you? Do you feel this age?
If you're not okay with answering this question.
No. I made a promise that I'm going to be an open book in the show. So I'm 40.
Okay.
And do I feel this age? No. I feel like I'm 34 or something in my head.
Why do you feel this exact age?
Because 40 seems like I should have already had a kid and a house and a family. I should have already gotten married and stuff. So I don't feel 40.
But like, if you are in Korea, there are like a lot of people who are not having families or whatever in their 40s.
Yeah, and those are, well, to me, I feel kind of part loser. Yeah, but for me, if you're 40, it feels like I should already have all my stuff figured out, but still I'm figuring stuff out. So
okay, let's explore what is your stuff.
yeah, where did you grow up? What kind of place was it? So I grew up in Thailand, Bangkok, Thailand. I went over to Bangkok, Thailand when I was I think I was like 3. And I went to kindergarten, elementary school in Thailand. So that was the place I grew up, and it was actually good life actually over there. It's summer all year around. The food is great. It's warm, and it was really. I think I had a better childhood compared to kids in Korea.
Why do you think so?
Because I seen like kids in Korea.
You mean when you grow up already or back then?
If I'm like looking back, and if I'm like seeing these kids in schools, elementary schools, kindergartens, what they're going through, like Korean kids compared to my childhood was much more better, because Korean kids, they study hard even in elementaries, like they go to hagwon, if you know what hagwon is.
Of course.
Yeah, like they go to
study.
study a lot, go to bunch of hagwons. But for me, if I came back from school, I used to always every day go to swimming, you know, go outside, like play ball with kids.
So you were like more like a person who enjoyed their childhood, right?
Yeah, I enjoyed my childhood.
But do you see like the difference between you and like the people of your age right now? Because like your childhood was different.
Yeah, of course. I
What is the
think I
difference?
think the way of thinking, but I wouldn't say it's just a childhood. I would say it's like a different cultural background. So I was raised in little different cultural background. So I think it affected me in some ways.
So what is like in what way your way of thinking is different from there?
I think I'm more open minded. I think.
Do you live alone?
Yeah. I don't live alone, but I think I'm pretty open minded. I think so.
I like how you pronounce it with this.
Yeah, open mind.
Yeah. With
Yeah, it's becoming a meme, so.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's explore the next question.
What was your favorite cartoon actor singer as a child? Okay.
Yeah, choose one or whatever fits
Oh, I
you.
have each one, but what you want to hear?
Everyone.
Okay. Favorite cartoon character? That's a Sonic the Hedgehog.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I remember being so happy when I first got my Christmas gift, and it was a Sega Game Gear, the portable gaming system from Sega,
Yeah.
and it had this game called Sonic the Hedgehog,
Yeah.
and we also had the cartoon Sonic the Hedgehog, which I really loved. So that became my childhood favorite cartoon character. And singer, Michael Jackson was my favorite singer.
What about Avril Lavigne?
That was my high school crush.
Okay.
But as a childhood, Michael Jackson definitely would be my favorite singer. Uh, they showed this Michael Jackson concert in TV, and I record in a videotape, and I used to play that over and over again, and like trying to figure out his dancing move, and I started dancing by watching Michael Jackson's concert.
Was it one of the reasons why you started to do like music entertainment, whatever?
I think so. Part of it, but I never imagined myself as being a performer or singer because by nature I'm introverted. I believe. I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. So I never thought I would be doing any singing or performing on stage. But maybe secretly I had this kind of envy of that, the the performing,
So it was like kind of what's inside of you. Like,
Yeah, inside of me,
You-
but never expressed it that I'm gonna do that or anything, or never thought that I will be doing that. Just secretly, just admiring doing that performance. I've been working in music industry for a while, and I had to listen to so many different music style and had to understand, the all the genres and the styles professionally. So now it feels like I have lots of artists that I like, and I cannot like put it in like in numbers or anything.
yeah. But why Michael Jackson is still like number one for you?
It was a shock to me when it during the time when I was a child. It was very shocking to me to see those types of performance, those songs, those like all that was very magical to me at that time as a childhood. So I think that impact is still, I have that in my heart. So I'll definitely say the Michael Jackson would be my favorite singer of all time.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I did have a celebrity crush on Avril Lavigne.
Is it because of how she sings or how she performs, or just because it's her?
That's the first time I actually saw the emo girl, a punk emo girl. Like that was a starstruck to me, And I thought I was going to get married, but with Avril Lavigne.
Mm.
That's what I imagined.
Yeah, they tell that like a wife or whatever, like a soulmate, like
Yeah.
a love of your life, they usually look like your first crush.
Oh, really?
Mm.
Really?
Mm.
That's interesting.
Do you still like stick to emo girls?
Yes, but now I'm old enough to
Mm.
now know better. Okay, I gotta stay away, stay away from too much crazy girls. Yeah,
Mm.
I mean, I love the style though, but now I'm not. I don't. I cannot do that crazy lifestyle as an extent.
But Avril Lavigne lifestyle is not like crazy or something.
Well, Avril Lavigne was like a, like she would like smash guitar on stage and she would skateboard and she's a rocker and like not care about rules. So it had that vibe. But if you take that to a real world, then it's going to be a problem. Yeah.
Mm. That's why you are doing skateboarding now.
Oh, yeah. It always ends up like that. Yeah, I think it does affect me in certain ways.
Mm.
But yeah, I'm old enough to know better now.
Okay, next question.
Was there someone you admired or wanted to be like? This is hard. This is weird because I never thought about being someone else. Well, the closest one would be someone like Nirvana, Kurt Cobain.
Who died really early?
Yeah, but take away the you know
Okay.
the death part,
Okay.
but like the how he could do what he loved and have passion about it and have an impact on you know like uh, the generation and stuff,
Mm.
that kind of thing. I'll admire it.
So you admire the part of him living a lot for the generation?
Yeah, being like an icon for a generation,
Mm.
like being a part of the history.
Mm. Would you like to like leave a trace for the history by yourself?
No, not really. I mean, if I'm going to answer this question, I'll say Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, but I don't think I like thought deep enough and think about, oh, I want to be someone else. I don't think I ever thought about that. I admire more people who actually create something, and I think that also kind of overlaps on admiring a certain musician as well.
Mm.
Like that is also creating something, creating an influence, creating a history of the generation. So yeah, I think I kind of admire those aspects.
Mm. Wow. So that's why you started coding, by the way?
I think so. No, 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 not because of that, just because of fun.
Mm.
I started coding when I was very young.
Mm.
I just wanted to build myself a game.
Mm.
I was curious how computer games were made, and I started to learn how to code.
Was it at the same time when you did this Warcraft or?
No, way before. I
Oh.
was like 13.
Mm.
World of Warcraft was my dumpster years around my early 20s.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
My early 20s when I had my first breakup and I was miserable and I didn't have life and I started smoking and did Warcraft and I was having a worst years of my life. That's when I had a near death experience. But way before that, I used to code. I love computers. I started to build some games, and then at the same time, I wanted to write a music for my own games. That's when I started to learn how to, you know, create music
Mm.
with a computer.
Mm.
So yeah, it
Have you
became
checked the book that I told you like tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow?
not yet,
Okay.
not yet. Yeah.
Then nothing to discuss on it.
What were you like at school? Popular, invisible, rebellious? Uh, I wasn't popular, that's for sure. Was I invisible? I'm not so sure because I was this a dude would just not care about anybody else. I would always have my earplugs, listen to music.
You were one of these guys?
Yeah,
I wouldn't imagine you were like this.
yeah. I would just keep listening to music. I had my own thing going on. I was into music, so I would write songs and like all I care about in my childhood was just making music, writing songs, and I didn't care about anyone else. So
So,
was I invisible? I don't think so because if we had a talent show, I went up the stage and like sang my own songs and all that. I wanted to learn to write good songs for my games, and with that obsession, I was like, oh, I guess if I want to write more better songs, I need to learn about chords, and if I want to learn about chords, I guess I need to learn how to play guitar. And then I started learning playing guitar. Maybe if I want to get good at playing guitar, maybe I should join some kind of a band. And then I participate playing in some bands, which were in around that time we were performing in like Ide, like some clubs. There were a bunch of Japanese copy rock band, copy of Japanese rock bands with all these makeups and like all that.
you
Like
did
so
that?
in 15, 16, I would go on stage doing that. I would lie about my like I had been started playing guitar like just over 2 months, and I would lie to the bandmates like, oh, I've been playing guitar for 2 years. And
And they believe you?
yeah, and I tried so hard to keep up and figure out stuff, and I started performing with them. And yeah, and next thing you know, you're writing songs for yourself. And next, like, and then the college, you have to go to college. So at that time I'm like, okay, what do I do? And I guess I could go to art school. I've been doing music for a couple of years. So
So it seems like you are the type of a person who really like dive into
yeah,
what you are starting to do.
yeah. But to the teachers in high school was shocked to them. Like I will go home after like 3 or 4. I have my own stuff doing. I have to make music, and I want to be a musician. And the teachers would, kind of laugh at me, like, what? Like,
Did they tell you that you're lazy or something?
they thought I would have no future because being successful musician is like the odds were, like only like within 1% would make a living out of, being a musician, right? So they would generally just smirk at me and laugh at me. But I was so sure about myself, so we had lots of trouble with the school and school teachers and me. And I would go like, okay, I'm gonna quit high school.
And you did?
I did not. Okay, is there something that your younger self that you rarely talk about? Like some secrets?
Yeah, like something like stealing books from the shops or something like that.
Yeah.
For example.
Okay. That I did. I tried to steal a book from the bookstore, and I almost went to jail. Probably juvenile. I don't know. But yeah, I would talk about that. Um, so
And the worst part that it was Bridget Jones.
it was Bridget Jones' Diary. That was the first. So that was the first book that I taught me to understand romantic comedy.
Okay.
Yeah.
But why did you want to study romantic comedy based on
no.
Bridget Jones?
Not because I want to study. It's just that they said it was a best-selling book, so I wanted to check it out. And the thing was, I was a dude. I'm a dude. Not was a dude. I'm a dude. And I wouldn't have been interested in like romantic novels, or romantic comedies as a movie, right? But this Bridget Jones' Diary, I started reading it without knowing it was a romantic comedy. But it was a very fun story. So that's when I started to get, oh, romantic comedy is not that bad, like as a genre. Okay, next one. What were you most afraid of during that time?
Teenage years.
Not able to make it?
What did you want to make?
Not able to succeed of being a musician?
Did you have that picture of like the most successful musician? What would be a success for you?
Now I would say Paul McCartney. Because he's healthy, he's still touring, he's happy making music, so I would say Paul McCartney.
Yeah, his music is kind of healing.
Yeah. Who was your closest friend back then? I didn't have that much of a friend though.
But did you have like one that was like really around you at least or
In
something
high
like
school,
that?
I don't think so because I moved around, and I think for as a childhood, as a high schooler or middle schooler, if you move around, it's really bad for you. You lose friends. So for me, as also we used to move around a lot, so I don't have like deep, long term friends.
Yeah, I think it's just because you didn't have like Instagram or something like that back then, right?
True.
Because when I moved like in my sixth grade to another city,
Yeah.
I am kind of still watching like stories of these like friends from
Yeah.
my childhood,
Yeah.
and like we don't talk, but we are just put like,
Yeah.
put fire,
Yeah.
put some reaction.
So after I did kind of search for my friends from Thailand, from like my old schools, and I secretly kind of, see their life.
Do you have like this habit, like to sit once a year and to check out all of your like exes, like or your people from high school, like old classmates, something like that? Like, how does their life look like?
Like for you is a ritual. Like you have this.
No, it's not a ritual. It's just some day you can just sit and you're like, oh, how is this girl from my seventh grade is like?
Yeah, yeah. I tell you, kind of a funny story. I had a crush on this British girl when I was in Thailand.
You were studying in a British school.
In Thailand, so I was like probably 10 or that's when I had my first lifetime ever crush, and she was British. And after I grew up and became an adult, and I just remembered her for some reason, and I was curious how she was doing. And we at that time we had MySpace. Do you know MySpace?
Yeah, I heard about
You heard about it. You never used
it.
it.
Never.
We had MySpace, and I went to extent to find her, and guess what? I was so sad. She became a stripper and a prostitute.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Because usually when you search for your school friends or something like that, they usually like have a family already at the years.
Well, it was my early, mid 20s, so I don't think anybody would have a family already at the time. Well, maybe some might have, but mostly everyone's busy trying to figure out their careers. And my first crush turns out to be being a stripper and prostitute. So that was a bit funny.
Yeah, reliving is better.
But she was also alt emo.
Of course.
So, yeah. So I have something about alt and emo girls.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's next?
What are your happiest memories from your university years?
So long pause. Wasn't it funny for you to be at university? Wasn't you rebellious anymore?
I think university days, I started to learn to blend in.
Okay.
I think the university years was the years that I started to lose myself. I used to be so sure about what I want, and like I was so rebellious. I would go against the odds. But in the university, now I'm starting to learn how to socialize, go out on parties, blend in. That's
Why do you think it happened? Like,
because I went to the art school, and
mm,
in the art school, all these kids are very talented musicians, right? And I would admire them. Wow, these guys are so talented, and maybe I have something to learn from them. And all these kids, maybe the vibe has made these kids to be like that. Were like very like pessimistic, like, hey, you know what? When we graduate, we don't have nothing. We don't have a proper job and stuff like that. And they would just go partying. They won't like dream of bigger dream.
mm,
So they would just be chill, socialize. And I thought I needed to be like that. And I started to lose myself. And that's the time when I started dating girls, started drinking, started smoking, and stuff like that. So, well, happiest memory was my first relationship started from college. So that would be
okay.
happiest memories and the worst memories
At
at the
the
same time.
same time.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
After graduation, who did you think you would become? Yeah, this is weird because after graduation, I would think like I'll just be an office worker.
Really?
Yeah.
So you like to that extent you just dived into like Korean style.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I started working in a company as an office worker. Uh, it was a company that produced English textbooks. So they would day to day, the daily task would be there would be tons of papers on your desk, and you have to go through them, check the typos, and notice some errors. That was my job.
That's crazy. Like it sounds like these university years, though it was a art school, so it sounds like a place where you need to learn to be more open, to
Yeah.
be like artistic,
Yeah.
something like that. But it just worked oppositely for you.
Yeah. Even with all those talented kids, they become so pessimistic for some reason. And when they're a group of people, uh, they lose their dream. They try so hard to blend in, and you're no longer that bright minded, talented musician anymore.
So you think that when you are losing like your wishes, your like mindset, whatever, it's when you are trying to blend with the common
Yeah,
average.
yeah, because that's when I just convinced myself maybe this is the way. Because all the talented guys, musician, professors were telling me that. If I was in high school, I was the only one who was trying to be a musician and trying out different stuff, right? But in college, everybody was like that, and everybody was trying to, you know, blend in. So I thought that was the thing I had to do, and gradually I started to lose dream, and I started to just work in this as a office worker as a English in an English textbook company.
Yeah.
I think I did that for like 2 years or something.
Wow. So why did you stop? Like, did you realize that it's not your path? Or
Well, at that time, I was living with my girlfriend at the time, and she she was also going through hard times, and I tried to provide everything for her. And when there was a time that I saw her trying to hurt herself, right? So I came back from work. I came home, and I see this shower, running in the bathroom, right? And like I didn't pay attention to it, but she would never come out. Like she's in the toilet, bathroom, the shower's running, and I called her, no answer. So what's going on? She's been in there for like hours now. And I tried to open the bathroom door, and it was locked. We don't usually lock when you're living together, right? So I started panicking. What's going on? And I forcefully open the door and I see her like bleeding and kind of harm herself. Like she has her like a wrist slit,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
she's in the tub, like
Yeah.
and bleeding is crazy. And that moment, I felt I was like I was just breaking down. My knees were like crumbling down to the ground, and I don't remember how much I cried at that moment. Of course, everything was fine. I called the ambulance and all that, and everything was fine. But after that, we broke up, and that's the time when I thought like, okay, I have to make some changes in my life. Like all this like college thing, my relationship, everything dragged me down to a very, really bad place.
Yeah, sounds like that.
Yeah, I was living in like a half floor panja, half floor, you know,
Under
yeah,
the.
underground. It was very, it's it's not healthy to live, half floor, because it's too humid and
Humid mold.
yeah, you get mold, and like these mold kind of also affects your psychology.
I really understand. I live in a place like that.
Okay. So you should avoid that place. But I was at that time a very bad space, bad time in my life. So after that, I quit job and I tried to turn things around. Yeah.
So what did you do after that? So how did you change your life?
Well, I just quit job. So one day I would, actually day to day job was you get tons of paper on your desk and you have to
Go through everyone.
yeah, work through all that papers and pass it on to the next person. If you don't, the process,
Chain is
the
stopping.
chain has a problem. So it's a really big deal if you don't do your job. But one day I was just sitting there and I didn't feel like doing it. Like, what am I doing? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Like, there was a why moment there.
Yeah.
So I just did nothing the whole day, and I just went home. And my boss calls me, what the fuck is happening? Where's your papers? And I just said, oh, you know what? I didn't feel like doing that. And he was yelling, and he was so frustrated, and he would say, "You're fired. Like, don't come tomorrow."
We're really happy about it.
And I was like, not happy, but like kind of relieved. Okay, now I'm stopping to do this, and I got out of the house. I went back to my parents and started making music. So
Okay.
that's when I started to turn things around.
So was it a successful path after?
Yeah. From that time, I would lock myself up, and I would just say, I'm gonna make 10 songs, and I'm gonna do everything, all the production, recording, the songwriting, everything. I'll just do it myself, and I would make it so good that it will be a hit.
Was it?
Well, I tried. I'll make it so good and it will be a hit. And I locked myself for like, I think almost for 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So I would lock myself up. I didn't do anything else but sleep, wake up, make music. Sleep, wake up, make music.
Sounds like really dedicated to.
Yeah, so crazy. And my parents were concerned. Like, is he crazy? Why isn't he going anywhere? Like, you should go out and search for jobs or blah blah blah. Like, what are you going to do with your life? And they were also miserable. They were crying at my room door. Hikikomori.
Yeah.
I was that.
Really.
They would leave my meals on the door.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You're not. You didn't allow them to go inside.
Yeah. No.
Wow, that's crazy. If I wouldn't allow my parents to go inside, they will just kill me and just throw away from the
Yeah,
house.
I will go crazy if they try to do that. So I was a bit off at that time, but I wrote songs, produced all the songs, and I got the 10 songs ready. And then I thought, now what? Like, okay, I have
What should
I
I
have
do
the
with
demo.
this?
and it's all perfect song, like sonic quality and everything is perfect. But I had no idea what to do with it. So since I didn't have any connection to find any singers to sing those songs, so I decided to do it on my own. So I started to perform myself to promote those songs. I went to YG, SM, JYP to,
Yeah, it's entertainment production
yeah, entertainment
studios.
production to, I would send them demos. I would, slide into these security doors with other
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
workers, and
Sleeping in.
yeah, slid in and leave my demo tapes
Yeah,
on the tables.
yeah. Did it work out?
None of them
No.
uh, none of them replied to me, and I just decided to just release the song myself. And I went, at the time there were a company called Cyworld, and they were releasing these songs to be streamed on their platform. So I went to that office and left my demo on the table, and they replied to me. They were interested in me, and they were figuring out how to start a music business for themselves, and they thought I was kind of a great artist to start with. So they would kind of, these team were so excited to promote my album and stuff. So that's how I started my debut album. And they would promote me. They would put on shows. Like they had this digital music award thing going on, like huge stage. They would put me in the opening. That's when I saw the first the group called FX debut. That's when the G Dragon had done his first
Yeah.
album performance, and yeah, like that was the debut for the 21. So that's when I started to get into the music business. After that performance, worked as a I worked performing my own songs. But as I do that, lots of companies start to contact me for songwriting, asking me to produce songs for their singers. And I was lucky enough to work with many big names, and I had a couple of hits, national hits as well. That's how it worked out. Looking back, I think it's like 50% luck and 50% of effort.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how do you feel about this path that you went through your music career? So, are you happy about like how it came out?
Yeah. I feel blessed and lucky because I saw many kids who really try so hard, work so hard without sleeping anything, like working for the careers, but not able to, break through the music industry. Of course, I can say I really tried hard as well. I
Yeah.
was, trying myself, pushing myself so hard to get into that career. But looking back, I think 50% is pure luck.
Okay. Now we need to say to our viewers that if you wanna know why Baksa went from music career to IT career and building his own startup, write in the comments and tell us if you're interested, because it is the most interesting part of the story.
Yeah.
But for now, just tell me, what is your dream right now?
I don't know. I want to start a family. I want to have a kid. I want to get married. I want to be responsible for my own family. I don't want to be responsible for other stuff anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so it's like more about having your own life and
Yeah.
like sticking to yourself.
Yeah.
So it's like you chose yourself.
Yeah.
You first.
If it was like 10 years before, I wouldn't imagine myself saying this. But now I'm like, okay, I'm done with it. I'm done with being responsible for some things some people that I don't really care. So I want to be responsible for just few people that I might really care. That will be my family, right? So that's my dream. Maybe it will change next year, but
Okay.
currently this is the one.